guess I'll start on that sort of note about last year and everything. Um, Sport has been one of the most heavily affected industries with cancellations. Over here in the UK, we had no sport for so long. But MMA and UFC in particular, sort of started the wave of sport coming back. What's your experience been like in sort of coming back from those cancellations and returning to work at a regular schedule almost?
Well, the one thing I think a lot of us UFC staff members knew was that Dana White was going to try to get back. And it wasn't necessarily that he was going to try to get back first, but the nature of our business is such, the nature of our television contract is such that we need to be putting on live events. So I think when we were looking at going to Lemoore, California back in April of 2020, maybe to me as an individual and a family man, that seemed a little bit premature. But I think Dana White is the type of guy where, you're not always seeing eye to eye, but you want to run through a wall for the guy. So I think as a staff, if I could speak for our whole team, we couldn't wait to try to execute a show for the guy. As an American, I will say, Harvey, that I was a little bit frustrated at the lack of domestic credit that the UFC got. And, there are a lot of people who say, hey, it's about making a contribution. It's not about getting credit. And I understand that line of thinking, but it wasn't like these other leagues were looking to the UFC or looking to Dana White to try to figure out how to get their sports back up and running expeditiously, So I don't know. At times I feel like as much progress as we have made as a sport, we're still the fifth of the mainstream sports on the outside looking in. But certainly it was as big a year as we've had, especially given the circumstances. And just excited to get back at it here, man, in about a week.
Yeah, and even now, like you said about the credit, even in the UK now, boxing has been stopped. And there's not really been a hint of that happening in the UFC. It's sort of been so consistent. And your first event back after cancellations was UFC 249, Ferguson versus Gaethje in Jacksonville. What was it like suddenly adjusting to having no fans in an arena? Was it weird? Was it sort of hard to adjust, or did it sort of come naturally?
Well, the headphones, the headset we wear is a pretty powerful thing in terms of noise cancellation. So I feel like very much when I'm doing a broadcast that I am in a bubble and I'm in a tunnel, and obviously I'm excited to have the crowd support back, but it's not something that is a crutch or something that I lean on. But to your question, it was super weird when it first started because we walked into Jacksonville and we didn't really know what type of beast we were walking into. We didn't have plexiglass in front of us, so every goddamn word we said was being heard by the athletes. And then when you would have a climactic moment and had to punctuate a fight ender, you heard your voice like bounce off the wall literally and right back in your face. So that was certainly an adjustment for me, especially as the guy that is sort of charged with putting a capstone on those moments. But I'm telling you, Harvey, by the second show in Jacksonville, I wasn't even thinking about that. And by the time we got to Las Vegas, there was plexiglass, which helped a little bit. But I've always said the crowd is a performance enhancer for a play-by-play guy like me. And I don't know the extent of the crowd in Abu Dhabi, but I'm excited that, when somebody knocks somebody else out, it won't just be me screaming.
Yeah, that's one of the great things about having no fans. I think what made the O'Malley and the Garbrandt knockout so good was the angle and the replay where it was just the raw arena footage and you can hear you guys screaming in the background. It made it feel like so much more bigger than it was. You, the fans, energy of having them, because it has been good to hear, like with things in the highlights the UFC put out at the end of the year, you had stuff like Poirier doing Bisping during the fight. Do you like having that element of it, or do you prefer having the energy of the fans back?
I have some appreciation for that element. We've talked a lot about this because there are certainly broadcast partners of mine who are going to miss this environment when it's gone. It's certainly a lot easier to go take a piss in the middle of a live event when you're not battling fans and having to say no if somebody wants a quick picture or something like that. So and I certainly think from an aesthetic and from a visual standpoint for fans, they enjoy it. They enjoy some of that visceral audio that they're able to hear. And we are trying to let some of that bleed in a little bit. You may have heard me say this before, Harvey, but when we go to a corner camera, we don't even need to go to the corner cam right now. And you can still hear a lot of that audio and it bleeds onto the broadcast. So I like that component of it. But to me, I don't like the fact that, Jan Blachowicz wins a UFC light heavyweight title and he doesn't get showered with, fan approval. So for me, if I had a choice, and I know I don't, I would want fans back, packed to the nines, every step of the way as much as possible.
And the UFC is just going into its third stint over in Abu Dhabi, Fight Island. What's the whole fight island experience been like for you? Because there's, with all the safety protocols, the different fight times, the quarantining and the traveling. From a perspective of a viewer, it's been such an incredible spectacle. What's it been like being someone there and the whole experience of it?
Well, it's stressful. It's challenging. It's a lot. Oftentimes we're staying up during the day, and then we're staying up all night, and then we're sleeping during the day to try to stay on the time zone to have the most optimal broadcast. And in this COVID-19 climate, we've just had a lot of fight cancellations and a lot of formatic changes. And when it comes to our live telecasts, so it has been challenging. I mean, the environment itself at that W Hotel on Yas Island, it's intoxicating. It's one of the most special places I've ever been. And there's definitely a more special vibe in the air doing fights in Abu Dhabi than doing them at the UFC Apex, with all due respect, So I much prefer to do fights on Fight Island than at the UFC Apex. But, it's been a challenge, man. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There have been a lot of last minute changes, and, I did more travel and worked more hours in 2020 than ever before. And, thankfully we had a 3-week respite to sort of recharge the batteries. And at least right now I feel ready to go. I don't know if I look it, but I feel ready to go again.
I'm sure we'll hear that you are in a few weeks. We'll hear that voice going again. In recent weeks, or before obviously the break, you were sort of showing fans more of what went on behind the scenes with your work preparing for events over on Instagram. How much work really does go into an event, into a big pay-per-view with the amount of fighters that are going to be on a card and all the facts and stats you have to get ready? How much work do you have to put in before an event on your end?
Man, it's hard for me to quantify it in terms of hours. The one thing I'll tell you is that the show we do on January 16th, that was only going to be on ESPN Plus and is now on ABC, that'll get just as many hours out of me as a pay-per-view. There are certain challenges I have on pay-per-view that I don't have on a regular telecast. I'm pre-voicing a lot more elements for pay-per-view. And of course, there are no commercials, so it's me saying "brewed for those with a fighting spirit" every other minute. So the pay-per-view preparation is more daunting. But in terms of the fighter preparation, I don't shortchange any of these athletes. I try to give every athlete at least an hour of my time. And that might not sound like a lot, but when you're in a back-to-back situation and you have 15 fights, that's 30 hours on just the fighters alone. And that says nothing of show formatics or anything else. So these shows are a totally different beast than doing like a 3-hour American football game. Thankfully, Harvey, it's the devil that I know now, and I'm starting my 10th year with the company. But my anxiety with this job is 99% in the preparation and maybe 1% in the performance.
And you mentioned you started with the UFC 10 years ago. You made your debut alongside Kenny Florian. Jim Miller versus Melvin Guillard was the event. You'd worked with Florian for ESPN2 before. What was that? Did that make it easier on your debut, working with someone who you'd worked with before? Was there any nerves going into it? How did it all come about, your debut, and what sort of preparations had you made?
Certainly it helped having my dear friend Kenny Florian alongside, and that will always be a special memory for us. But yeah, I think it was a little bit nerve-wracking when Dana White pulled us aside beforehand and he just said, we didn't hire you guys to be Joe Rogan. We hired you guys to be yourselves, and go get it. He gave us a pep talk, but that kind of served to make me nervous. I did Bellator season 1 in 2009. And that experience was invaluable to me, because had I not had that experience, I would have been showing up to call my first ever mixed martial arts fight, and it would have been the UFC. So I was more nervous for episode 1 of Bellator 1, season 1 in 2009 than I was for my UFC debut call. Because back then, when Bjorn Rebney hired me, I think the cupboard was a little bit bare. There weren't a lot of obvious MMA play-by-play guys. And I remember hanging up the phone, Harvey, and saying to my wife, I think they got the wrong guy. I don't know if I'm the guy. But a couple years later, when the UFC call came in, I felt a lot more ready. But yeah, man, it was a whirlwind for sure. I wasn't getting a lot of play-by-play opportunities at ESPN in Bristol, Connecticut, and that's ultimately what facilitated the move for me.
And that event, your debut event, was also the debut event for Khabib Nurmagomedov. What's it been like, sort of, as your career's gone on, sort of sharing the same time with such a legend, and what's it been like calling his fights up until the point of his potential retirement at UFC 254 last year?
Well, it's been special, and it was special to sort of see the picture of me interviewing him in my first show, January 20th, 2012, and then seemingly his last fight, obviously late last year. But what's interesting is to go back and watch the call of his first fight, because we didn't know what the papaja was, the wig on his head, and our whole preparation methodology has changed so much since I started. I remember when, I showed up to work for the UFC and I said, "Do you have a pronunciation guide?" They didn't have a pronunciation guide. You fast forward a couple of years, now all of our fighters say their names to tape, and our whole process is just much more thorough and exhaustive. We have fighter meetings that didn't exist before. I was used to calling football games where not only are you getting time with maybe players or offensive coordinators, but you're getting 15 minutes with the head coach, So thankfully our preparation philosophy has really evolved a lot, because I think about walking into that first show, January 20th, 2012. I had fighter bios and I had whatever I could find on the internet, but it's not like the UFC was sending me film or pronunciation guides or anything of that nature. They weren't giving us time with the athletes. So, thankfully I don't totally cringe, Harvey, when I go back and listen to some of those early calls, but certainly special that for me and for Kenny, that the first night we got to work together on a UFC telecast was Khabib's UFC debut.
Does it give you some sort of perspective of how of your own success and career longevity, I guess, in the business, that you've sort of seen a fighter go through his whole career with the company while you're still calling the fights? Does that sort of hit home a bit?
It's interesting when you say it, it does. I don't really have a lot of time to look back and sort of enjoy the fruits of our labor. And I think part of that is just the nature of the UFC schedule and the breakneck pace that we keep. The other part of it is that I have 3 kids that humble me daily, so I do feel like at times I'm living 2 different lives, so I go home and I'm totally checked out when it comes to a lot of the noise in the MMA space. But yeah, I think it's gratifying. When you get older, it's hard getting older. You're a young man. It's hard sitting here 42 years old. My hair went straight from black to white, went directly past gray. So yeah, I think that that's something that I should probably lean into a little bit more. And it's certainly crazy when you have a fighter like sign in the UFC in 2013, after I've been there for a year and a half. And then to see them either retire or get cut, it's like, man, I called that guy's whole UFC career. So yeah, I think I should probably lean into more reflection. But man, our schedule's so crazy. There's just not a lot of time to think about, past shows and where you've been.
And you obviously, we've mentioned you've been in the business for a long time. Do you still get as excited when it's the massive name like Conor McGregor comes back for a fight? But the preparation for this one, is it still as nerve-wracking knowing that you're going to be calling Conor McGregor's return in front of really the biggest audience that the UFC is going to have across the year?
Yeah, it's exciting. I don't know if it's more nerve-wracking necessarily. I try not to think about how many millions of people I'm staring down the barrel at when I'm doing that pay-per-view open. But yeah, obviously it's an uptick in the overall excitement when a guy like Conor McGregor is fighting. For one circumstance or another, I haven't had the chance to call too many of his fights, whereas Dustin Poirier, I feel like he and I have been step by step, and I've called almost his entire UFC career. So yeah, it's exciting. I'm such a fight fan though at my core that like I get excited for basically every UFC main event, if not every prelim, right? But like Jack Hermanson versus Marvin Vettori, that main event gets me going to such an extent, even though it's a smaller show and a smaller card, So I'm glad that we got Conor coming up in a week, but I get pretty damn excited for all these shows, if I'm being honest.
How do you see that fight playing out? Because Dustin Poirier, since the first time they fought, he's a different beast now. And McGregor, obviously, in the last few years, he's only fought Cerrone. No disrespect to Cerrone, he's obviously a great fighter, but Dustin Poirier is almost in its prime right now. So how do you see that fight playing out?
Well, I think they're both primed athletes right now. I think Conor McGregor, it stands to reason, could be a totally different beast than he was back in 2014. It's been amazing to watch this sort of 2.0 version of Dustin Poirier come to the surface. And the Dan Hooker fight was just so exceptional. Not just for everything he got done offensively, but just for the chin and the heart and going 25 minutes. It was an emotional week for him for more reasons than one. So I do think Conor is fighting a better version. It remains to be seen as to whether or not that will matter, because I don't think Conor McGregor gets the credit he deserves for being one of the top 2 or 3 strikers, if not the best striker in the entire UFC. So I just think in terms of his distance management and his power and his precision, he just has a little bit of a striking advantage. But obviously, there's a lot more to the game than that. I think it would be wise of Dustin Poirier to try to extend Conor McGregor a little bit. I also think that the atmosphere has really benefited certain athletes, and other athletes have paid the price when it comes to either no fans or having to be in quarantine or having a swab stuck up the anatomy of your head. I mean, there's just a lot of different variables, and Poirier has been in a regular competing cycle, and he has experienced a lot of these things. So could be an advantage for him, but I think it's a competitive fight. I do think it's closer than the odds makers have it right now, but I do believe Conor McGregor deserves the distinction as the betting favorite, and I won't be at all surprised if he's able to get it done and get it done rather quickly.
Hey, this is ring announcer Joe Martinez, and you're listening to Ropes and Cage.